The events will be starting soon.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Cambridge Union for a fascinating conversation about espionage, where we'll be welcoming Ben Macintyre, best-selling historian, and Jack Barsky, former KGB sleeper agent. Joining us on Zoom is Jack Barsky. He's a German-American author, IT specialist, and former sleeper agent of the KGB, who spied on the US from 1978 to 1988. He was exposed after the Cold War, and Barsky became a resource for US counterintelligence agencies and was allowed to remain in the United States. His biography, Deep Undercover, was published in 2017. He loves public speaking and is available to speak at any gatherings you might please. Joining us live and direct is Ben Macintyre. He's a writer-at-large for the Times of London and the best-selling author of A Spy Among Friends, Double Cross, Operation Mincemeat, Agent Zigzag, and Rogue Heroes, among other books. Macintyre has also written and presented BBC documentaries of his work. His new book, Agent Sonia, The Spy Next Door, is on sale right outside, and it has just made #2 on the bestseller list. He'll be signing books after the event. Please join me in welcoming Jack Barsky and Ben Macintyre.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So it's such a treat to have a live audience and to have Jack all the way from south of Atlanta. It's lovely to be back in Cambridge, my old alma mater, although it's a long time since I was here, the nest of spies that it is. I was recruited on my last day at Cambridge by a Don, now sadly no longer with us, but who approached me sort of crabwise over a sherry and said, you know, Ben, there are parts of the Foreign Office that are different from other parts of the Foreign Office, in the sense that they are different from the Foreign Office. And I knew exactly what he was talking about. And then I then went and did a very brief and extremely inglorious set of interviews with MI6, which thankfully came to nothing, but sparked this bizarre and long-standing interest in espionage and intelligence. So that's really why I'm here. But Jack, over to you. So why don't you tell us, well, you decide how you want to do this.
Yes.
But
by the way, your interview is very similar to...
So why don't you tell us your story?
When I... One second here. Your interview is very similar to when I was approached for the first time by the KGB. They talked about the government and if I had an interest in working for the government. But, you know, I just want to say a few words to start this off. I am delighted to be here, albeit only virtually. My dream was to be sitting right next to you, Ben, but it was not to be. You see, when just the word Cambridge, you know, brings to mind some really famous alumni, such as Ben Macintyre, I just heard, Charles Darwin, Stephen Hawkins, John Cleese, and of course, Kim Philby, the most effective spy for the Russians out of England. And I just want to say it's a phenomenal honor here, and I really mean that, to be here speaking for the Cambridge Union, the hallowed hall of free speech. And as we all know, free speech is the very foundation of democracy and liberty. So this honor sort of ranks right up there with the Order of the Red Banner that I received from the Soviet Union some 30 years ago. I'm just kidding, but I did get that. Anyway, Tara, thank you very much for working with me. You've been a delight, and you represented your organization very well. And finally, and I am totally thrilled to be able to have a conversation with one of my all-time famous authors of nonfiction. Ben Macintyre has a very rare talent. He can string together a bunch of facts, and the outcome reads like a novel. Delighted to be able to speak with you. I just want to say my favorite nonfiction book of all time is Agent Zigzag. If there ever was a picaresque nonfiction book, this is it. So thank you so much, Tara, for having me, and let's get the show on the road.
Well, what a lovely thing to say. We'll come back to this, Jack, but I suspect there are elements of your own life and perhaps even your character that are not a million miles away from Eddie Chapman, who was Agent Zigzag. I mean, that was the first book that I wrote in this genre, as it were. Eddie Chapman was a tremendous crook. And not that I'm saying you are, Jack. But Eddie Chapman was a professional, and he was, before the war, he was a con man and philanderer, and a gelignite expert. He blew safes in the pre-war period, and then he happened to be in prison in Jersey when the Nazis invaded, and he offered to spy for them in exchange for his liberty. And then he was trained in a special spy school in the south of France, in Nantes, and then was parachuted, not far from here actually, parachuted into Cambridgeshire near Ely. He hit the ground, fell over, broke his nose, and immediately defected to MI5. Offered to spy for the British against the Germans, was then in fact sent back into occupied Europe while working for MI5, although they codenamed him Zigzag because they were never absolutely certain whose side he was on. And nor indeed, I think, was he. I think if the Germans had won the war, Eddie Chapman would have been swaggering down the Kurfürstendamm and perfectly happy with the outcome. But that's not to say that Jack is in any way dodgy in the way that Chapman definitely was. Chapman ended up, by the way, as the crime correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, which I think was one of the great turnarounds in history, that he went from being completely bent to describing other people who were completely bent. But Jack said that his story, the Zigzag and the other things that I try and write are sort of fictional. Jack's own story comes straight out of, I mean, if you made it up, people wouldn't believe it. So, Jack, why don't you, and Jack is, of course, not Jack's real name, although it is now his legal name.
No,
but Jack, tell us your story. Tell us how you came into this strange world.
Okay, I have to give you the very abbreviated Cliff Notes version. Otherwise, we will spend the rest of the day talking about this. I was a student in the third year in East Germany, studying East Germany. I was born and raised in East Germany under communism. Studying chemistry when I was approached by the KGB. I had an informal relationship with a KGB agent while I was studying and eventually became an assistant professor at the university. Informal relationship for a year and a half, after which they decided that they found somebody who would make a real good undercover agent. And so I decided to ditch a very promising career for the adventure. Ultimately, you know, I was a very, very convinced, committed communist, but ultimately it wasn't to save the world, but it was to be able to go out and into the world and have an adventure that really made me decide that. I got 2 years training in Berlin and then another 2 years in Moscow. It turned out, and I had no clue that I had this kind of talent, that I have phenomenal talent to acquire other languages and also speak the other language with a minimum of an accent. So I got 2 years in training in Moscow, worked among others with the Morris and Lana Cohen, very famous atomic spies who also spent some 8 years in prison in England. And in 1978, I arrived here in the United States. And I had a birth certificate in my luggage. It was in a secret compartment for Jack Barsky. Jack Barsky was a young man who died at the age of 11, and the KGB, which they have done in many other cases, stole that identity. And so I came to the US saying, I'm Jack Barsky, born in the United States. It took me a year to acquire some other documents necessary to live and operate in the US, primarily a driver's license and a social security card. My first job was that of a bike messenger. And for a number of reasons, the KGB advised me to go back to college. I got a degree in information technology, started a career as a programmer. And in 1988, 78 to 88, this was the time frame, I did a 180. There was the KGB had a suspicion that I might be under investigation, and they ordered me back home. What they didn't know was that I had an 18-month-old child in the United States, a little girl named Chelsea, and no matter how I sliced it, I just couldn't leave that girl. The two options were pretty drastically different with regard to me taking a risk and winding up in jail and so forth. If I had gone back, I would have received a hero's welcome, but none of that mattered. So what happened there, I discovered my humanity, and ultimately that was a really good discovery. So I told the KGB, listen, I can't come back. I have HIV/AIDS. And maybe this is the only country where I might be able to get treatment. They believed the story. And I also did not defect. I did not turn myself into the FBI. I just withdrew. But 9 years later, the FBI found me. And that was a big surprise. I obviously at that time, I had no reason not to cooperate. I cooperated, and 5 years ago, I became a U.S. citizen. There is a whole lot more in there. There's 320 pages of book, and the editor struck about 50 of those. So I got to stop talking now.
Well, I have many, many questions I'd like to follow up with Jack about, and not least why you did it and why the FBI didn't then prosecute you. But before we do that, let me, if I may, Jack, just give a bit of context of the kind of espionage that you were doing. If correct me if I get this wrong. There are really two different kinds of spy. Sorry, Jack. Is that okay?
I'm sure you're going to get it right. You're the expert.
Well, not really, but there are really two different kinds of spy in the Russian system. There are legal spies, so-called, and illegal spies, nelegal. Right. Now, Jack was an illegal spy. So just to give that context, a legal spy is, well, they're not always legal, actually, but they are people who technically work for a diplomatic service, who are implanted abroad, usually undercover as some other job, some other diplomatic foreign office job. In reality, they are working for the intelligence agency of their country. We do this. MI6 does it, the KGB did it, the FSB does it, everybody does it. So those are legal spies. There's a second sort of spy, which is an illegal spy, which is what Jack was. And those are people who are implanted in foreign countries under the guise of being ordinary citizens, but who are nonetheless gathering information, usually in contact with legal spies. So the spy runner will usually be a legal, and the nelegal, like Jack, are often very much more numerous. There was a particular directorate within the Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters, called Directorate S, whose sole job it was to create false identities like that of Jack Barsky. So they would very often steal the identities, often of children who had died very young. They would then obtain illegally a passport or another document. They would then train up, and the training often took many, many years to make people look as if they had completely come from the country that they were supposed to be from. Believe it or not, there were more, and Britain was a great target for illegals. There were scores of them here, particularly during the 1950s and 60s. My own favorite was a man who went by the name of Gordon Lonsdale. That wasn't his real name. He was actually called Konon Molody, and he was probably the most famous of all the illegals that the Russians ever deployed. And he posed, and he's like a character straight out of Graham Greene. He posed as a salesman of bubblegum machines and slot machines to pubs on the south coast of Britain as Gordon Lonsdale. The real Gordon Lonsdale was a Canadian child who had died in infancy. And he was complete. I mean, his accent was perfect, as Jack's is. He melded completely into this country, and he ran one of the biggest spy rings in Britain for many, many years, called the Portland Spy Ring. But that's just to give you an example. Some of you will have seen the television program The Americans. Have any of you seen that? It's a long-running. It's rather good. It's not a million miles from the truth, and it tells the story of two KGB agents who are implanted into normal suburban life in America and end up living this very complicated and very difficult double life. And I suppose that's something that I'd love to talk to Jack about, which is that one of the lures, it seems to me, of this kind of world is the sort of eternal idea of being more than one person. That you can appear to be something on the outside and be something completely different on the inside. Now, is that something that, I mean, I think it's a particularly British trope. I think we sort of, something in our natural melodrama, it appeals to the national character. I mean, Kim Philby was a brilliant example. There was nothing Kim Philby liked better than knowing a little bit more than the person standing next to him in the bus queue. And he called it the ruthless exercise of private power. Is that something that you recognize, Jack?
Yes, I do. And I just remembered that one time when I was a bike messenger, so I delivered a package, and some lady said, "The messenger boy is here," and I was thinking, if you knew who that messenger boy is. So there is this air of superiority, and on top of it, I operated for a long period of my life outside of the law. In every country I spent time, including my own. So you know, it's something special. That was one of the reasons I said yes, and I think that's in your book. Kim Philby was once asked why he joined, and he said, well, if when a powerful organization such as the KGB asks you to join them, you don't think much about it. Exactly. You know, my ego, it was already big enough, but it was bolstered when the mighty KGB said, "Hey, we want you." Yes.
I think that's a really, really good point. I mean, Philby's a fascinating example of this. I mean, he was a man who loved the idea of an elite. He loved the idea of belonging to an exclusive club. And of course, by birth and what had happened to him in his early life, he was already in pretty exclusive club. I mean, he went to Westminster School, a pretty exclusive club. He went to Cambridge, a pretty exclusive club. He then joined MI6, which is a very exclusive club. And then he became the only KGB agent inside MI6, which is a club of one.
Yes.
And so I think in a way you can read Philby's life as as ever more kind of an ever tinier circle of people that knew the truth. And I think that was a real power for him. But spies, in my experience, operate often from a huge variety of instincts and intentions and so on. I mean, it's interesting to hear Jack say that you didn't, I mean, you were a true believer in communism. Is that right. True to say?
Absolutely, 100%.
But that wasn't your overriding impetus. I mean, often the spies I write about tend to frame themselves, and this is part of the way that they behave, tend to frame themselves as being ideologically driven. They all like to think of themselves as you know, fighting the good fight, whichever side they're on. But often it's a rich mixture of other motives. Do you think that's true, Jack?
Based on what I'm reading, but I got to honestly tell you, I was not going to sacrifice for the cause. I was attached to a good cause, but the dichotomy is that, you know, myself and a few others that I knew, those diplomats, we were trying to destroy a society whose wealth and benefit we would benefit from. So I was going to have the good life. To me, when I said yes, we had our own James Bond in East Germany. You know, I was going to be one of those guys. You know, one of those special guys who does well with the ladies and hangs out with rich people, and then do something good in the process. So it was truly a mix.
And what was your mission, Jack? I mean, what kind of information were you gathering, and how were you getting it back to Moscow?
Okay, so this is the one question I have a hard time answering, because let me tell you, initially for the first 2 years, the mission was to, become fully legal in the United States with bona fide documents. And afterwards, it was like, well, I was trained, so to speak, to gather political intelligence. In other words, get close to decision makers, or at least influencers in the political realm, foreign policy. They mentioned like organizations like conservative think tanks, the Hudson Institute, the Trilateral Commission. For some reason, they had as a target, and I was supposed to get close to them, which, because of my low standing in society, I was a failure. I just couldn't find a way. I had always the ongoing task to meet as many people as I can and profile them with regard to, would they be decent targets for recruitment. Particularly while I was studying, I may have found some interesting people that eventually wound up working for the KGB. They never gave me any feedback about anything. Never heard, well done. This is part of what the KGB did so well. Keep everything secret. I had some special tasks to do ad hoc, where I needed to travel outside of the area of New York, which the diplomats were not allowed. I think they had beyond 50 miles, they would have to ask permission to travel. And towards the end, I also stole some software. So it was a mixed bag. I was never sent with a list of things to do specifically. It was a see what you can do. And what I did not know, and that occurred to me much later by studying, and also particularly what I found in Mitrokin's notes, is that they valued my just being in the U.S. greatly, because during the 80s, there were some moments in the Cold War when it got really hot, and there was a possibility that all the diplomats would be kicked out of the country, and as such, the only operatives left in the United States would have been me and a few people like me.
One of the great. Oh, sorry, Jack. You still? Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, how did I transmit information? Secret writing, or when I had a lot to communicate, I would write the material on sheets of paper, photograph the sheets of paper, and then put the undeveloped cartridge in some kind of a container, and then the container would then be exchanged in a dead drop operation. I did not use telecommunication type vehicles to communicate. It was very awkward. I did get the instructions through shortwave radio, double encrypted Morse code, but this was the most awkward part of the communication, but probably also the safest both ways.
A dead drop, by the way, for people who don't know the sort of spy jargon, is a place where you leave information or receive instructions that you don't, so you don't make direct contact with your spy handler or the person, your spy master, whoever's running you. So they can be in any number of different places, and there's a huge literature about how dead drops, also known as dead letterboxes, work. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story in a minute about a dead drop box in Oxfordshire. But so one of the great, the thing that you most want if you're running an intelligence service is a spy inside someone else's intelligence service. That's the gold standard. That's the most valuable thing you can get, because that way you work out not only what the other side is doing, but if they're good, you work out what they're thinking of doing, what they're planning to do. So you're not just one step ahead, you're 2 steps ahead. That's what made Kim Philby the most valuable spy in history. He was a very senior officer in MI6. He was running the station. He was basically the head of MI6 in America. He was privy to an awful lot of CIA stuff, and it was all going straight back to the KGB. So that's a really valuable asset right there. Another, contrary-wise, again, one I've written about is the case of Oleg Gordievsky. You'll know the case of Gordievsky. Did you ever meet him, Jack?
No.
No. Gordievsky was a career KGB officer who in 1975 began working for MI6. He's the most valuable spy MI6 has ever had inside the Soviet intelligence service. He too rose very high in the ranks within the KGB. He ended up as head of the Residentura, which is the name for the KGB station here in Britain. And he was about to be confirmed in that role when he was betrayed by an American spy. And he had to then launch this extraordinary escape from Moscow. It's a bizarre story, but he was, if you like, the flip side of that coin. So he was a working intelligence officer that had access to really high-grade secrets, and it was such a dangerous business that he had running for 10 years an escape plan called Operation Pimlico, which was his way of indicating to his handlers in Moscow if he ever needed to get out, if he was in trouble. And the way that he did this was that if he was seen at a particular time of day on a particular street corner, Kutuzovsky Prospect in Moscow, holding in his hand a Safeway bag from the supermarket, that was an indication to his handlers that he needed to get out, and their way of indicating to him that they'd seen the signal and the escape plan could go into operation. And bear in mind, this is the Soviet Union. It was a really difficult place to get out of. I mean, it was the most heavily surveyed society there has ever been. The signal that MI6 had seen what was happening and had seen his escape signal was that they had to walk past him eating a Mars bar. It actually had to be a Mars bar or a Kit Kat, but it had to be one or the other. It had to be an English chocolate bar. And that was the sign to Gordievsky that he'd been seen. And if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to buy the book. But it's an incredible escape story. But the reason why I raise it is that those are the two examples that I know best of having a spy within the professional organization of another spying organization. When you were approached by the FBI, when they came across what you were doing, Jack, did they not try and double you? Did they not try and use you in that way to produce more information from inside?
Yeah, that would be the first instinct. Anytime you catch an agent from the other side, you try to double them. Here's the problem, though. I was already dead. As a matter of fact, what happened is the KGB bought my lie, and since in the 80s, AIDS was fundamentally a death sentence, they went to my German family and told them that I had died. So for me to get back into the game would have been nearly impossible, and it's super dangerous. So they decided to just debrief me at great lengths, and you got to go to the FBI to get that confirmed. Supposedly, what I was able to tell them was of great value to the FBI, and not the least the fact that what I wasn't doing, the fact that there was an illegal, and there's always this concern. This was at the time when Ames and Hansen had infiltrated the CIA and the FBI. There was always this concern, that there may be another one of those, and I might have been the handler. So that's all I can tell you. They decided I'm much more valuable speaking with them at lengths and than in jail.
I mean, just to give you an idea of the sort of wilderness of mirrors that this sort of work involves, and introduce you to another piece of spy jargon, a dangle. Now, a dangle is when you dangle in front of the enemy intelligence service or the rival intelligence service someone who looks like he's a defector or someone who's going to come over to your side, but in reality he's not. Okay, that's an attempt to plant someone inside a rival intelligence service. Was there ever a moment, Jack, when you thought, and we're getting into the thickets here, that the FBI thought that you might be a dangle, that you might be a plant from the Soviets trying to get inside the citadel?
I doubt it, but I did have to pass a lie detector test. So in other words, they wanted to make 100% sure. Because, you see, my situation was such, I had a family in the United States. I had 2 children. And they watched me. They investigated me for 3 years. They watched me. They knew about my life. They decided I was very much Americanized. You know, because of the time that had expired between me quitting and then the FBI coming to talk to me, you know, the dangle idea would have been rather, you know, it just wouldn't fly, I believe. But speaking of dangles, it's just like when one thing that was planned one time for me to do, to go to Australia and wake up a sleeper who Australians believed was a leftover from the Soviet Union. That was eventually scrapped, but that would have been a different type of dangle.
So in this country, we're all pretty well aware of what can happen to former spies who go over to the other side. We all know the story of Sergei Skripal and the attempted poisoning, the attempt to kill him, and Litvinenko, and there have been other cases too. How safe are you, Jack? I mean, are you in a safe house? Are you under guard?
No, not at all. I'm free to travel around in the country. I have been to a number of European countries. I've been to Germany, Poland, Sweden, Ireland, and I really wanted to come to England, but so far it's not feasible. No, we think that for Russian intelligence to plan and implement an action against me is highly, highly unlikely, because you probably know these assassination attempts or whatever you want to talk about are very, very complicated to plan and implement. And if there's a list of targets that exist someplace, I would be near the bottom, because I didn't betray the motherland. They take that very seriously. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. East Germany doesn't exist anymore. And all the people that may have had a personal animus against me are probably not alive anymore, because they were all older than me. So having said that, if you pay me $1 million to go to Moscow, I would say no, thank you very much, because accidents are easy to arrange. And it's always, Putin is very good with sending messages. And that would be a message: we'll get you no matter what. But so I got to be a little bit cautious with regard to the countries I travel to.
That's fascinating. I mean, your existence then is an interesting and stark contrast to Oleg Gordievsky's existence.
Yes.
So Oleg got out in 1985, has been living here ever since, in a safe house under a different name. His neighbors have no idea who he is. He goes by a different name. He's just the little old man who lives next door.
Yep.
He doesn't even know this, but he's under 24-hour surveillance by MI5. His security has been massively boosted since the Skripal poisoning. He's quite insouciant about all that. He's experienced such fear in his life that I think the idea that Putin is, Putin has a personal animus against Gordievsky. His own career was damaged by what Gordievsky did. So there is reason to think that he's in danger. But I think his life is a fascinating one, really, because he really is a prisoner of history. He is unable to leave his own house. He cannot travel. He cannot go to the pub. He cannot go shopping. And yet he sort of has a kind of pride about it. It makes him very interesting. He's a kind of he is absolutely convinced that what he did was the right thing to do, and he was undoubtedly one of the most. I mean, he was the most valuable spy that MI6 has ever had. I mean, he was actually able to tell MI6 day to day what the KGB was planning to do, and it put them a huge step ahead. It actually changed the course of history, and yet he pays this price. And I think he's both one of the bravest men I've ever met and one of the loneliest. He doesn't live alone anymore. He actually has a former SAS minder who lives in the house with him. They get on fabulously badly. And they're always squabbling about who's finished the Weetabix and so on. I thought it would make a great lockdown story, actually. Although when I last ran Oleg, I said, how are you doing in lockdown? He said, everybody, they complain about lockdown all the time. I've been in lockdown for 35 years.
Yeah. So juxtapose this with the Kim Philby situation in Moscow. He thought, he would be free to wander around and do everything. No, as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, his apartment was bugged. The Soviets didn't trust him. Now, MI5 trusts Gordievsky because how can you not trust this man with the risks that he took? But anyway, I just want to reiterate what really drives revenge coming out of Russia. You must not ever betray the motherland. Russians have a phenomenal affinity and connection to Mother Earth that comes out of their peasant history, and I lived there for 2 years, and I can sense that the culture. It's all about Mother Russia, and this is one of the things that Putin is doing so very well. He's using that hyper patriotism to stay in power.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, many of us thought, the Skripal poisoning, for example, was reported as if it was a failure, as if it had gone wrong. My suspicion is that Putin's thugs and Putin himself didn't really care whether it went right or wrong. They wanted to send a message that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you're never going to be safe. And that brings me on to another interesting aspect of all of this, I think, which is that we often think of spy stories as if they are moral fables in some way, that it's a sort of battle between good and evil and right and wrong, and the good side wins and the dark side doesn't, and that somehow it will all come out in the end. Life isn't like that. History definitely isn't like that, and espionage certainly isn't like that. And it always seems to me that there is a human cost to these stories. Oleg pays a big price. His marriage, his wife had absolutely no idea, and he loved her dearly, that he was spying for the West. When he left Moscow, he left without telling her. She was held under house arrest, effectively, for the next 6 years with their 2 little girls. He didn't see them for that long. Eventually, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, she and the girls were allowed to come back to Britain, and the marriage exploded, as you would expect it to, in some ways. I mean, so his life was in many ways deeply damaged by this. And I think it's something that we often forget that in spy stories. I mean, the James Bond story always works out well in the end. That's not true of spy stories. And I'll just give you another example of that. In the book I've just written about Ursula Kaczynski, who was codenamed Agent Sonia. Now, she's in a way from the other side of the coin again. Her story is probably closer to Jack's in some ways, in that she was a convinced communist. She was born in Weimar, Germany, before the First World War, grew up in Weimar, Germany, and she became an absolutely devoted communist. She spied in Shanghai, she spied in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, then in Nazi-occupied Poland, then in Switzerland during the Second World War, when she was running a huge spy network inside the Third Reich, and she plotted to assassinate Hitler. She was an extraordinary woman. And then she ended up in the Oxfordshire countryside. If you'd met Mrs. Burton in 1943 in the little village of Great Rollright with her 3 children and her husband Len, you would have thought she was a perfectly ordinary refugee housewife. In fact, in the back garden, she had built an enormously powerful radio transmitter in the outside privy, which she was using to contact Moscow. And she was passing on secrets, the blueprints, really, for how to build the atomic bomb. She had an entire network of agents inside the wartime atomic weapons program. And when the Soviets detonated their bomb in 1949, that was largely down to Agent Sonia and her network. So she's another of these people who live this extraordinary double life. I mean, you would never have thought twice about Ursula Burton. She just seemed to, she baked particularly nice scones and she attended the village fete. I mean, she was absolutely, her disguise in a way was her gender. I mean, even when MI5 got onto her or thought they had detected radio messages coming from this vicinity, they sent these two men, obviously from MI5, who went to investigate. And there's a hilarious report in the MI5 files in which one of them says, well, it can't possibly be Mrs. Burton because she's much too occupied with her domestic duties to be a spy. So she's a great example of the double life. But she's also a remarkable example of how there is a human cost to pay with these stories, because her children had absolutely no idea what their mother really was. And when they discovered, really quite late in life, they were middle-aged by the time Ursula's story began to come out, they were shattered by it. And the elder of the children, who was 93 when he died last year, I interviewed him extensively. And I asked him what he felt about this, about the fact that that his mother had been someone that he didn't really know. And he used those words. He said, "I'm not sure I ever really knew my mother." And it damaged them, it damaged their relationships with other people. This lovely man, Michael, said, "I've been married and divorced 4 times. Maybe I never learned to trust anybody." So there is a cost associated with this, what is otherwise appears to be a tremendously glamorous and exciting world. Did you pay a cost, Jack? I mean, I know that your mother never knew what had happened to you.
My mother died not knowing what happened to me. She was still convinced that, this was my cover story, that I was working in Kazakhstan in a very secret installation to do space kind of research as a chemist. She went as far as to write a letter to President Gorbachev to ask him for help to find me. That is one of the dark aspects of my story. It gets even darker because I told you that I had a child in the United States. I was married here and I was also married in Germany. So fundamentally, I was a bigamist. But you see, and you probably know this, when you live a double life like that, the only way you can maintain your sanity is by compartmentalizing. And so I had 2 different languages and 2 different identities, and those two personalities did not link up very well. Now that once I was able to find myself after the FBI was done with me, I connected the 2. But when it comes to damage, relatively speaking, I got away with a lot of stuff because, it looks like, it was nothing but a happy ending. I'm remarried again, and I have a 10-year-old child. We live in a nice house. But there is damage in that, there's, the word redemption comes to mind, but how do you really come to grips with the fact that you thought you were a good person and you damaged some of the people that were closest to you, and that you carry with you to your grave, even though it's not on a daily basis, but there's some damage, and I'm going to be very frank. I also had some issues with alcoholism, which is not unusual for amongst agents. Kim Philby is one of the famous drinkers. So yeah, there's damage, definitely.
I mean, I'd only add one thing to that, which is that in the books I've written, that in the end, I've sort of come to the conclusion that secrets, in the end, are very bad for you. that secrets are toxic and addictive. And once you've tasted the drug of secrecy as part of the fabric of your life, it's often extremely difficult to give it up. That's not to say that working with the intelligence service is not a noble thing to do. It can be, but the secrets have a kind of power in and of themselves that is very different once it gets into your soul. And Ursula Kaczynski, the character I was describing to you, Ursula Burton, I mean, she retained her secrets until the end of her life. And I think she would have said also that she felt in the end it didn't do her any good. So yes, sorry, we've gone on, and there must be questions. So let me hand over to you.
Yeah, I have a few questions for both of you, and then we'll hand over to a few questions of the audience. You both mentioned sort of the psychological pain and representing the good versus bad, the internal struggle, as well as the external struggle being really difficult to crystallize down to the good side versus the bad side. I wanted to ask you, Ben, how you represent those different sides in your books, and then ask you, Jack, if you ever felt like you had a change of heart and realized what you were doing wasn't the right thing, and how you were able to cope with that.
I mean, it's the central conundrum of all spying, really, in a way, is that you frequently end up doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. I mean, we often forget that, I mean, what MI6 does, really, as distinct from MI5, the security service that maintains security within Britain, effectively highly efficient intelligence police work, and then MI6, which is very different. MI6 sends its agents, its officers abroad to try to persuade the citizens of other countries to break their own laws at huge risk to themselves in order to provide secrets and intelligence for our nation. Now, that's already quite a moral conundrum just sitting there. I mean, I've spoken to many MI6 officers, some of whom say one of the trickier aspects of what they do is that they are persuading other people to do things that are not in their best interests. They're in the interests of the British state, they're in the interests of the crown, if you like, but those individuals are going to end up, quite conceivably, with their lives very, very changed, and that's why they have to be compensated very well. I mean, it's one of the secrets of intelligence work that no one ever really likes to admit, but a lot of this is about money. If you are persuading somebody in a foreign country to betray their own country, often at risk to themselves and their families, you're going to have to look after them. And money, I mean, is really one of the oils that oils the wheels of this story. It's not often admitted, and no number is ever put on it, but that doesn't make spies greedy necessarily. It makes them liable to be compensated properly when it happens. So there is a lot of sort of, it's not a black and white story. There's a lot of grey in it, which is what I like about it, really, because I don't think life is about black and whites. I mean, unless you are a zealot of some sort, life is painted in shades of grey. And part of the fun of studying history, and part of the reason why I loved studying history here, was that we were encouraged not to see things in black and white. And I try not in the books to pass moral judgment, really. I mean, it's not really my role. My role is to tell the story as accurately and honestly as I possibly can. I'm sure I do colour it in lots of ways, but I try not to. And Ursula is another very good example because, of course, her story is not straightforward. For the first part of her life, she was an anti-fascist, brilliant anti-fascist campaigner. She was on the right side of history. She was trying to destroy the Nazi regime. And then history pivots on her. And when the Cold War starts, she's then spying against Britain. She's no longer on our side. So I thought that made her fascinating because it was a way of looking at a woman who really is two sides of a different ideological coin for us in lots of ways. And her life spanned the whole of communism. She was very young when the Bolshevik Revolution took place and very old when the Berlin Wall came down. And her life, it doesn't provide easy, simple, prescriptive answers. So that's a slightly roundabout way of answering your question, I hope.
And you want my part of the answer? Quite frankly, I never regretted having spied for the wrong side. And I tell you why that happened. I had the benefit of a very slow, gradual decontamination. Growing up, we were brainwashed. From kindergarten to elementary school, high school, university, we were fed nothing but communist ideology, communist propaganda. I never heard a counter argument. I also didn't seek out the counter arguments because I didn't see a reason to. You know, I could not watch West German television. I grew up in an area where you couldn't receive West German television. It was called jokingly the Valley of the Clueless. But I also didn't seek out radio because, you know, I was actually doing pretty well and I was on my path to join the elite. So I believed in the cause. I came to the United States as a 100% fully believing communist. And so in my decision to leave the KGB had nothing to do with ideology. There was a personal decision, but then the wall came down. And I was able to, you know, I said, well, what happened there? I was as surprised as the CIA and the KGB, what happened there? And so I had the ability to do some research, and slowly but surely, I understood that even the biggest hero in my life, Vladimir Lenin, was a murderous crook. And so, but that happened to me slowly over time. So ideologically now, I'm as anti-communist as it gets. The only thing that I do regret is, you know, the damage that I've done to people, you know, the quote unquote collateral damage. Luckily, I had the opportunity to reconnect with my two German sons, and we are now a family that sort of hangs together across the ocean. But that's a whole different story.
I mean, it's fascinating that, isn't it? I mean, one of the reasons why Britain in the 1930s was so vulnerable to KGB and Soviet penetration, particularly in this city, if you like, was because there was freedom of thought. In the 1930s in Cambridge, there was a fantastic ferment. The Spanish Civil War was going on. The fascism was on the march. Many intelligent, right-thinking students believed, and many of you would have been of the same stamp, I think I probably would have been too, felt that the only way to stop fascism was communism. That was the only way to do it. And it was only because there was freedom of thought in Britain that they could even voice those thoughts. But it did, of course, then make them very vulnerable to recruitment by the NKVD, which was the predecessor of the KGB. And they set out to do it in an extremely systematic way. They deliberately picked off graduates, as you lot will be, because they knew that they were going to be useful members of the establishment and society, and they knew that if they could get them recruited early enough, they'd be what is known as upstream recruits. They would have been recruited upstream of whatever would happen to them later in life. And they were, in a way, they were a different sort of sleeper, if you like. I mean, a different way of implanting people in a foreign country. It wouldn't have happened in the Soviet Union because, as Jack's just described, there was only one ideology in the Soviet Union. There was no opposite set of thoughts that you could cleave to. So I think, you know, you pay a price for freedom in a way, and one of those is that you are vulnerable to recruitment by the other side.
Oh, you're vulnerable to being spied upon, you know, as an open society compared to the closed society. You know, operating in Moscow was tremendously difficult for the CIA and MI6. To me, there were fundamentally no obstacles at all, and even there was a huge number of diplomat agents in Washington, D.C. and in New York. The FBI at one point, and I have some friends who were actually operating in that unit, 400 people in New York that were like, their only task was to, you know, keep an eye on the diplomats, and they were supposed to find some illegals. Of course, they couldn't find anybody.
All right. With that, I'm going to open up questions to the audience for Ben and Jack. So if you have a question, just put your hand up and wait for one of our stewards to pass the microphones to you. The gentleman in the navy shirt.
Do you think that there's still a possibility for individuals such as Jack or Philby or Gordievsky to exist now? And then if so, what would their profiles have to be? And I want to just caveat it with that I'm not trying to make myself into that person. Probably.
I mean, I've been told, and of course there is no way of proving this, that there are more sleepers operating in the West now than at any time during the Soviet era. Now, of course, sleepers are different these days because there are open borders, because you can travel freely. There isn't this iron curtain that you have to infiltrate people across. Even in Jack's time, you know, getting across the iron curtain was part of the difficulty. They come in many different forms, all the way from, you know, properly embedded people who have been trained to do this kind of life, to agents of influence, to people who are second, third generation of different nations. But yes, I mean, human intelligence is still absolutely central to intelligence gathering. We tend to think these days that because the emphasis is on GCHQ and signals intelligence, which is, it's always been a division in intelligence studies between human intelligence, which is gathering intelligence from humans, and signals intelligence, which is intercepting communications between other people. And that goes back to Bletchley Park, and even long before Bletchley Park with telegram interception. But today it's all about emails and text messages and internet profiles and so on. So it is much more technical these days. It's much more about signals intelligence. But human intelligence is still absolutely vital to the whole thing. It's still, in the end, even if you know that your target in Raqqa is using a particular kind of Sony telephone and you're going to have to hack into it and you're going to have to pick up the signals, you still need to have somebody on the ground who knows when he's using it, somebody who can report back to you. It still is about looking somebody in the eye and trying to work out who they are. And of course, the net offers huge opportunities for deception. I mean, you can do extraordinary things on the internet now, including creating completely false people. You know, you can create an avatar in a way much easier now than you could in the past. So yes, I mean, I think the profiles, I would hesitate to give you a profile because I think they're so multitudinous. I mean, there are many different ways in which intelligence can be gathered, and it's no longer quite as simple as it was because intelligence can be gathered in so many different ways, including from journalists. So, you know, and the distinction line between journalistic inquiry and citizen inquiry and intelligence gathering is blurring all the time because all those people do the same things, asking impertinent questions, digging into things that they shouldn't know of. But today, you know, citizens do it all the time because citizen journalism is such a booming thing in our times.
I agree. One additional thought here. The Russian intelligence agencies are, I think they're throwing more people into the game and they're not as thoroughly trained. Unlike the KGB, they don't really seem to care whether their people are caught or not, because, you know, they just sending out more, and they don't care if it's a little dirty. And there's also an aspect of, you know, scaring the Western world. Well, you know, if there's one there and there's one there, how many others might there be? That's a different approach because the KGB was really, really very much concerned about their agents being caught. They would rather, like in my case, it was a false alarm, but in my case, they thought I might be on an investigation, so they called me back, not necessarily because they cared about me, but they didn't want their agents caught. So that's a big difference.
I think you make a very good point. There's a much more scattergun approach, certainly from Moscow at the moment, which is sort of throw everything at it and see what sticks. And I think that is absolutely right, because it's a very effective and actually very cheap way of projecting power. It's somewhere between soft and hard power, but simply demonstrating that you've got your spies in the enemy camp, or making the enemy think that there are spies around them, which has been done very effectively by the Putin regime. That itself has a power profit. That's very, very useful stuff to do. We do it as well. I mean, all sides do it, but Putin, the Kremlin's particularly good at it at the moment.
We've got a question coming in from the forum. Patrick from Hughes Hall has a question for you. That Gordievsky seems like another remarkable and impressive man, and he's asking what your impression was of him when you first met him.
I spent a long time with Oleg Gordievsky in the safe house. In fact, I totted it up once. I think I spent 145 hours with him in this incredibly overheated. He kept it at kind of extraordinary. You'd think it was the Siberia out there, but it wasn't. It was really hot. My impressions, I mean, our initial relationship was quite tricky. I mean, Oleg, for understandable reasons, was quite suspicious of somebody coming along to tell his story. He became more and more into the project, and I was greatly helped by MI6 in that. I mean, I was never given any formal help by MI6. They never let me see any of the files. They never let me, but they didn't stop me from interviewing Oleg, which they could have done. And they encouraged me, indeed, to speak to the MI6 officers who had run his case over those many, many years, 15, 20 years nearly. They're not really supposed to do that. MI6 officers sign a secrecy agreement whereby they will never talk about what they do, but in this case, they were allowed to. But that was as far as MI6 would go, so I couldn't have done it without them. And my relationship with Oleg evolved, and we became very close. I mean, he's a complicated man. He can be unbelievably rude sometimes, particularly to women. But he can also be very funny. He can be very charming. And we grew very close. And I found in the end he was a brilliant interviewee, really, because, and this is a slightly odd point, but we all have our memories. Memory is a very fallible thing. I mean, we all have, it's very fungible. You know, we think we remember what happened, but if any of you have siblings, your siblings will say to you at some point, that's absolutely not what happened. You've completely made that up. So our memories move and they change over time, and the more we tell a story, particularly if we get a good reaction to it, the more we are likely to embellish it. And that is as true of spies as it is of anybody. In fact, it's probably more true of spies than anybody else, because they live in this sort of imaginative world. And Oleg, I would have these slightly tricky moments with Oleg sometimes when he would tell me a story of what had happened to him, and he'd be very specific about it. And I would have to say, Oleg, I don't think that's quite right, because I've spoken to the case officer who was watching you, I've spoken to the supervisor who's picking up the messages at the same time, and what you've described is actually wrong. And there would be this long, rather Slavic look that he'd give me, and then he'd say, well, okay, you know my story better than I do, then you can write whatever you like. Which is rare, because most interviewees, you know, we guard our memories and we think we are the guardians of our own memories, but our memories can be wrong. So I was incredibly lucky in the Oleg case that I was able, as it were, to sort of triangulate it with other accounts to try and get it even closer to the reality than he thought he remembered.
The gentleman in the brown jumper, right in front.
Since both of you, albeit in different ways, are so familiar with the history, I wonder to what extent that affects how you view the political actions of Putin, and if somehow there's a different perception which you have, which perhaps isn't covered so much in popular news, for example.
You want to take this
one up first, or shall I?
Sure. Putin has spun this aura about him that he was some kind of a super spy. False, completely false. Actually, I met a one-time boss of Vladimir, Oleg Kalugin, who still lives in the United States, who was, I think, in charge of counterintelligence in the first directorate. And for a while, he was Putin's boss, and he has nothing much good to say about Vladimir's career as an agent. What Putin is so, the fact that he was in the KGB helped his career tremendously, because when Russia went from communism to capitalism, the only ones that really knew how to work a capitalist system were the ones that had some experience in the West, and a lot of them were KGB, and that gave birth to the oligarchy that's now installed. But what Vladimir Putin is incredibly good at, he's a master politician, and he reads the Russian soul and character so well. That's what makes him good. But the fact that he was an agent, you know, he was a bureaucrat someplace in a city not too far from where I was born, and during the Cold War, in that city there wasn't much happening. So that's my 2 cents about him.
I mean, I'd only add to that we think of the KGB historically as being this brutal, cruel, despotic operation. Some Russians, I wouldn't say many or even most, but some look back on it with great nostalgia. I mean, the KGB was, at its height, an extraordinarily efficient Praetorian Guard, if you like, for the communist project. There were more than 1 million people in the KGB at its height.
Yes.
It permeated absolutely every aspect of Russian and broader Soviet society. So some look back on that with a certain amount of nostalgia. And if you look at the people around Putin, many of them are his cronies from that period. They're not. Another sort of fallacy in the West was that somehow when the Berlin Wall came down, Russia overnight was going to become cuddly and a friend of the West. It didn't happen that way. I mean, many of the people who were in the KGB just carried right on through, and many of them are still in power. So if you see historical parallels between the techniques used by the latter-day secret organs of the Russian state, if you see parallels with the KGB, that is no coincidence. The techniques and the methods have not changed all that much. I mean, from dead drops to wet jobs, they're still doing the same thing, and that's partly because, as Jack rightly says, Putin has brilliantly leveraged a very mediocre KGB, and not a very long KGB career, but he wasn't much good, into this kind of overarching butch, macho symbol of his own presidency, and that's a very clever piece of politics. That.
We've got time for one more question. The lady in the front row.
You said you were approached by the intelligence services as a young graduate. Do you think you would have fit into the world of espionage? Or how has your perception of that whole world changed through your research and through your life?
You're talking to me, right? So this is very interesting. This is I found out after the fact that I was excellent material for this job. Not just because I was reasonably bright, but I am fundamentally fearless. I have spent my entire life, up until maybe very recently, playing. I played the game, and I played the game to win. So when I signed up and when I wound up in the United States, you think I was ever afraid? I knew nothing would ever happen to me. It was, and I got this odd sense of humor that my wife still doesn't understand. I don't take myself seriously. So, and I think that is very important. Otherwise, you can't survive in that game, because if you're driven by fear, there's always something to be afraid of. And And fear is the worst motivator for action. And an agent will blow up if he is, he operates based on fear. So that's not bragging. It is who I was. This is my basic makeup. It's not good, or bad. It's just different. And so then, I mean, there's more to be said. The KGB actually was looking for people with particular character traits, and I found a list of these traits in an interview that was given by one of the heads of the directorate S, and quite frankly, I fit that profile to a T. So that's I had no idea. When I walked into this, did I know I was going to be a good agent? No, but I certainly was going to try, because, as I said, I'm very competitive and always trying to, play another game and have change in my life. And that hasn't changed anyway, even nowadays.
In stark contrast to Jack, I would have made an absolutely hopeless spy. I'm convinced of that. My flirtation with them was very, very brief. Very, very short indeed, a matter of only a few months, at the end of which it became quite clear, I'd by this point signed the Official Secrets Act, it became quite clear to both sides that I really wasn't the sort of thing they were looking for. Partly because, as I've just demonstrated to you all, I find it very hard to keep a secret. And actually, generally, as a journalist and a book writer, I'd much rather reveal secrets than keep them. I think it's a healthier thing. But obviously, I've remained in some ways fascinated by that world ever since. And I think Jack makes a very good point. It does take on all sides of intelligence work, it takes a very particular kind of mind, a very particular kind of character to want to do this and to want to stay with it. And the intelligence services are these days extremely good at spotting those sorts of characters. I don't think a Philby would ever be recruited these days. I just don't think it would happen.
On that note, thank you both so much for speaking with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. I wish we could continue this as a series with Ben.
Thank you.
All right. So I just wanted to